Welcome, my name is Z, and I'm your host for the Framework Developer Bootcamp. This show is for people who want to become web or mobile developers. Really, anyone who wants to learn programming will learn about new technologies and coding techniques each show. My goal for this show is to give you a taste of the kind of work developers do, and the tools we use for every project. Today, we'll be taking a look at some of the new features coming to JavaScript with the release of ECMAScript 2017, also known as ES8. Because JavaScript is run in the browser, every browser has its own implementation of the JavaScript engine, the piece of software in the browser that runs JavaScript. Google Chrome, for example, has an implementation called V8, Microsoft Edge has one called Chakra, Mozilla Firefox has SpiderMonkey, etc. ECMAScript is the underlying standard which ensures that JavaScript code you write will work mostly the same in all those browsers, which use different JavaScript engines. We'll be taking a look at the async await keywords, the major addition introduced by ES8, and how they simplify writing asynchronous code in JavaScript. During each episode of Framework, I'll be inviting you to follow along with me. As you're watching, don't be afraid to pause the video, or watch it more than once, so you can enter the code or type in the commands right along with me. Thanks for watching Framework. Let's get started. We'll start by taking a look at how to write asynchronous code in JavaScript, and how the evolution of the language makes that task easier. Before we get to asynchronous, let's talk about what synchronous means. Here's a snippet of what a synchronous code may look like. So here, I have some code that interacts with database, which I'm going to load them into the variable DB. And in here, I'm defining a variable called characters. I'm calling the fetch characters method of the database to fetch a bunch of characters and passing in some parameters. Okay, so once the database responds with a bunch of characters, we go on to the next line. Here, we map all those characters we got into objects, and for whether the character is alive, we're making another database call here, is alive, and we pass in the character's ID and some other parameter. So here we get an array of character statuses. And once this is done, we go to this line, which is going to print everyone seems to be fine to the console. And after this is done, we go on to the next line, which says finish going through the script. So this is what synchronous, or also known as blocking calls, look like. They're blocking because when we're on one of the lines, for example, when we're fetching characters, we're not executing anything else until this method responds, either with a failure or with data that it fetched from the database. Now, that may sound alright, but having the process waiting for the database is actually very inefficient because the act of waiting is still chewing CPU on the server. And if you have a lot of clients or users connected to the server, that waste of CPU adds up. With asynchronous programming, we don't have to wait for the fetch characters to respond to proceed. We could do something like this. And here's an example of an asynchronous code. Here, we define an empty array called status. We call db.fetchCharacters, and we pass in some parameters. Notice here, we also pass it a function, an anonymous function, with a signature of error and data. This function here is what's known as a callback. And that means once we finish executing fetch characters, we call this function. So let's say the fetch characters request went out, the database responded, and now we're within this function. And then we check if there's error, we print the error. Otherwise, for each data that we received, which contains characters, so really data here is just a list of characters. So for each characters, we then call db.isAlive on each character. We pass in the parameters as usual, and then we give it another callback to the isAlive. So this function is executed after the database returns the result of whether that character is alive. And then within this function, we check to see if there's error. If there is error, we log it. Otherwise, we're going to say, okay, this character seems to be fine. We push that character's status into the status array. And then if the current character is the last one, we write everyone seems to be fine. And then at the end of the script, we log it, finish going through the script. Let's try and run this and see what happens. So I'm going to use node here. So I'm going to do node callback to run this script. So there's a bunch of output. So let's take a closer look. So here, the first line of output says, making a call to database to fetch characters. That message is logged when we call the fetch characters. And you can actually see, I've defined all the functions here in the database.js. So you can actually see here, when the fetch characters is called, we log this message, making a call to database. And then once this method is done, it says finish running fetch characters method, which is this line. And then notice that the line out that comes after is finish going through the script. So once it finished fetch characters, it didn't execute any of these, and it went straight to this line. And then the script is done. And then we get responding to fetch characters with data. And this is also printed within fetch characters. I actually set a timeout here, so after a random seconds, this method is going to respond. So once the timer runs out, we're logging respond to fetch characters with data. So that's what's happening here. And this is within this. So once it logs responding to fetch characters with data, it's actually calling this function here. So now at this point, so notice that we actually went through the entire script and then we went back up to here. So it's not a linear going down line by line like we had with synchronous script. And the benefit here is that we don't have to wait for this to finish, thus saving CPU on the process. But if we're not careful with this, notice that there's so many code nested within each other. For example, this function is nested within the fetch characters. And then within that, we have if and else. And then within that, we have a data for each. And the layer gets pretty complicated. And this is just two methods. Let's say if we want to check more things and get more data from the database, this could be really unwieldy very quickly. Now, there are ways for experienced developers to make this easier to digest. For example, we can extract anonymous functions out and give them names, like this. Function, process, characters. And then we could get this entire function out and put it here. Instead of writing the function here, we could just write process characters error data like this. So we're going to cut and paste. And then we're going to take error and data. So this could improve the readability of this, but it's still very cumbersome. So with ES6 version of JavaScript, a new feature called promise is introduced, which provides an alternative mechanism to callbacks. Here I prepared a file of the same code that uses promise. Let's take a look. So we're doing the same thing by loading the database file into a database variable. We're creating an empty array. And then we're calling fetch characters, except this is a slightly different version of fetch characters. Instead of taking a callback after all of the other parameters, it returns a promise. What that means is that we can use the .then call to chain all those promises. So here, once we call fetch characters promise, we then go into this block. And in here, we're creating an empty array of characters. And I'm only doing this to show chaining here. So, because we could chain multiple thens together. So I'm creating empty characters. And then I'm going through the data, and for each character in the data, I'm pushing it into this list. And then I'm returning another promise, a resolved promise, with that characters array. And then with that resolved promise, I could chain it again with another then. And in here, I'm calling the isAlive on every character. And here I'm also using a slightly different version of isAlive that returns a promise instead of taking a callback. And with this, I could also use the then to specify what happens after this method is done. And then if there are errors in any part of the process, I can use the catch to catch those errors and print them in the console. And same here for the outer chain for fetch characters promise, I could also have a catch here to catch all the errors. Now, this is not necessarily a less verbose way of doing this, but it does make this look a lot easier to read. So for example, all the code are not nested like before. They're in order. There is some sort of order here because we have a then, which is executed before this then, and then we could catch everything here. And this makes it a lot easier to read because we're used to going line by line. And before we keep going, I'm just going to run this and show you the outputs. So I'm going to do node. It's very similar to before. So when we call fetch character promise, we print this making a call to database to fetch characters. And then we're done. So then, because the next line we get is finish going through the script. So once it gets through this whole thing, it prints this. Because we're not waiting for fetch character promise to respond. And then after we get through the whole script, this part responds. You can see that responding to fetch characters with data, and then we're making calls to check to see if everyone's alive, and then we print everyone's alive. And then here is where everyone seems to be fine. Now, with ES8, ECMAScript 8, which is a standard that JavaScript complies to, and it's the newest version of ECMAScript, there is a much easier way of going about it, which we'll be taking a look at right now. So I have another script here called async await. And here's a script that does the exact same thing as before. But you see how this is much better. So here, in the first line, we include the database just like before. And here, with ES8, we get a new pair of keywords, the async and the await. So the async marks a function as asynchronous. And within the asynchronous function, we could use the await keyword to mark calls to functions that are asynchronous. And instead of having to chain them or specify callback, we could just assign the results directly to a variable, like this. dbFetch character promise, which is the same method that we used in the previous example. And we're putting a await in front of it. And then once this finishes running, we get the data that gets returned. So we don't need to chain the promises, nor do we need to specify callback. So once we get the data, we could do the for each data, and then we define another function for the for each, which is also asynchronous. And within this function, we're calling the isAlive promise, and we're giving it an await here, which is very similar to before. And this will give us the direct result of this call, instead of giving us a promise that contains the result. So after this, we're going to log this guy is fine, and then push this guy and his status or her status to the status array. And then if this is the last person, we're going to print out everyone seems to be fine. And then at the end of the script, we're going to log finish going through the script. So I can run this right now, and you'll see how this is the exact same thing as before. So we call fetch characters, and then it's not waiting for the database to respond. It goes right to the end of the script, right here, finish going through the script. And when the database finally responds, we get responding to fetch characters with data. And then after that, we make a call for each characters in the list that we get back, and to assure us that everyone's fine. So notice how this looks a lot more like a synchronous program, where it's executed line by line. But underneath the hood, it's actually not doing that. It's still behaving the same way as the callback and the one using a promise, but it's much easier to read. So this is the newest features introduced by JavaScript, and it's going to greatly simplify promise-based code. And since a lot of JavaScript code is promise-based, this is a much valued addition to the JavaScript language. In this session, you got a taste of writing asynchronous code the old way, and you see how recent revisions to ECMAScript greatly simplified the readability of JavaScript code. But why stop here? If you enjoy this show, why not give the Framework Professional Developer Program a shot? We help you become a professional developer in as little as 20 weeks. Our program is online, but everyone in the program has their own instructor, so your questions are always answered. You can try the program for free. Just sign up at learntoprogram.tv/p/try-framework. See you next time.